Happy Monday, kitty cats. And if you are listening to this program today, then I know that you are a person who cares about their liberty. It's also a pretty good chance that you're pretty tired of waiting around for political change, tired of being duped by political parties and politicians filling you with hope and then never coming through. Well, guess what? If you're ready to take matters into your own hands, then I want to tell you about an amazing community called the Nomad Network. This is the #1 community for liberty-minded people just like you who want to create freedom in their lifetime by focusing on entrepreneurship, investment, and income mobility. I have personally been involved with this group for some time now. I hopped on because I got into a stage in my life where I realized that I was ready to take things to the next level. I was sick of just talking about my liberty, and I wanted to take action to actually achieve that liberty. And the Nomad Network has been an incredible hub for doing just that. You got people in there posting their W's, talking about their businesses, helping each other out, hiring each other for jobs. It truly is an amazing network. It is a little bit of that building the arc that we talk about so much, building that next pathway, building that community so that we can thrive while the rest of the world just burns around us or does whatever it's going to do. Whether you already have an existing business idea or you just want to network with like-minded people, the Nomad Network is the place for you, and you can join for free right now by heading over to www, and you do need the www, by the way, www.nomadnetwork.app/lion, no S, lion. Take control of your own future. Seize your own liberty. Join the Nomad Network today.
We need to empower people with not just the philosophical tools, but the inspiration to break free from the system.
Welcome to the flagship Lions of Liberty podcast, your weekly dose of education, inspiration, and real-world application from the top minds in the liberty movement.
If you want liberty, we need to be better leaders, better husbands, better fathers, better friends, better businessmen. We need to be better people.
Here's your host, your guide, your shining beacon of liberty, Marc Claire.
Live long and live free.
All right, my guest today has both a YouTube channel and a Substack through which he discusses politics through the lens of the Neoreactionary philosophy. We'll discuss more of just what that is today. And he recently posted an article on his Substack entitled Libertarian Diagnostic Failure. So you know this one is going to ruffle some feathers. I'm very pleased to welcome Charlemagne. Charlemagne, are you ready to roar?
Let's go, as the Zoomers say on Twitter these days.
All right, Charlemagne. Well, I've been, loosely following your work for a little while now. I think I might have first heard you on Buck Johnston's show, Counterflow, maybe a couple months ago. And then I came across this article that you wrote, Libertarian Diagnostic Failure. We will get into that in a bit, but I do want to discuss a little bit more just kind of about your background and how you got into the whole neo-reactionary movement. So if you could just kind of discuss kind of where you were politically, if anywhere, before you got into this neo-reactionary philosophy, and then kind of dive into just what that means exactly.
Yeah, so where I started politically was basically in the default liberal position that Andrew Breitbart has described before, where you're effectively just a normie who just sort of takes everything you see at face value. You probably don't actually watch the news, but you sort of get your ideas of how things should be through, university and just the mimetic propagation through culture. So I was pretty apolitical before I got into politics. And then, of course, in 2015 and 2016 especially, some really crazy stuff started happening in the political sphere. And I don't only refer to, the candidacy and eventual presidency of Donald Trump, but also, you started to see things like Islamic terror attacks happen in Europe a lot. And, that's pretty strange thing to see. And, so interesting things were happening in the world. And I started thinking I should start taking things seriously, start looking into this. Ironically, the thing that got me into politics was I saw that, people were saying like Donald Trump is like the next Hitler and it's something. And I was like, oh, that sounds concerning. I'd better look into this. And then I looked into it and wow, okay.
What a disappointment that must have been.
So, that
I was told there was a Hitler coming. What is this?
Yeah. So, that leads from one place to another. You end up through all these different rabbit holes. I found people like Jordan Peterson and all that. It's pretty mainstream stuff. Gamergate happened. I was watching a lot of the YouTubers that, followed that. And I decided, I should try making my own content, because this seems like, I want to contribute my voice to all this craziness in culture. So I'll just try that out. So I did, and I started a YouTube channel. And eventually, as you start talking to people, they start referencing philosophers and ideas that you didn't know, you weren't taught. No one told you that these, ideas existed in the mainstream culture. And, eventually one of the philosophers that I was introduced to online was Mencius Moldbug. And so people were sharing his old blogs from the early aughts, let's say around 2004 to 2007 was, I think, his prime time. So people were sharing these articles in 2016, 2017. And Mencius Moldbug, who now really goes by his real name, Curtis Yarvin, he was a blogger back on the mid years of the internet, and even way back on the early internet. And he wrote this really interesting post on Blogspot. It's an open letter to open-minded progressives, and essentially what this is sort of the foundation of the neo-reactionary perspective on things. And it's sort of this structuralist deconstructing of the actual systems from like an engineering perspective that sort of explain how power in the United States government actually flows. And it sort of unpacks the sort of myth you get taught, just in normal school, basically, about how you have these three branches of government, and you have democracy and electoral college, and there's checks and balances between these branches, and there's like this two-party system, and there could be other parties, and these parties are supposed to represent like differing philosophies on the government. This is kind of the normal way politics is taught, but then neo-reaction sort of deconstructs this and examines, okay, well, this is how we're told power works in the U.S. government, USG, but how does USG actually work? And how it actually works has been sort of touched on by other people before with terms like the uniparty or corporate oligarchy, or this kind of idea. What Moldbug did is he sort of took it a step further and said, okay, well, the way the government is really run is by this sort of atheistic religion called progressivism, and this progressivism comes out of the universities primarily ideologically, and it gets spread by the media, and sort of through this cooperation of a state of a press and church or university, which he calls the cathedral. So the press plus the universities is the cathedral, and this basically represents a religious institution. This religious institution has essentially come to rule the U.S. government through a progressive atheocracy. So we don't have separation of church and state as we're supposed to. And he also examines other interesting ideas like freedom of the press. But one thing we often don't talk about is freedom from the press, right? So people understand what a state-controlled religion is, or what a religion-controlled state is. People understand what a state-controlled press is. What does a press-controlled state look like? And that's actually what our state looks like. That's what our government is. It's a press-controlled state through this thing called the cathedral, where the universities come up with the ideas of what is progressive, what is progress, what is the liberal thing to do, and then the media promulgates these ideas and sort of forces through its powers of what people call cancellation now to basically bend the knee, so that the way the system works is that the elected politicians who are supposed to actually have control over the government actually don't really have any control over what the government is actually going to do. They're sort of just stand-ins. They're sort of just filling in this this legacy role to sort of keep up the appearances of democracy, when we're really sort of just running in this corporate oligarchy backed by this progressive religion. Even normies kind of understand that the real power in Washington comes from the money, right? The money from these giant corporate interests. But it is a little bit more complex than that. One of the things that Mencius Moldbug asks is, well, how do all of these universities and media outlets sort of come to the same conclusion simultaneously, right? A lot of times you'll see people say there's some conspiratorial deep state cabal actually controlling all of them directly. But if you actually look for evidence of these connections, they're actually not there, right? There's no evidence that Harvard and Brown and the New York Times and all these other institutions sort of have this power structure over them. So how do they come to the same ideas about how our society should be run, how we should live in a biomedical security state? Well, the answer of how they simultaneously generate the same philosophy is that they just have a shared religion. And we're now under the dominion of that religion. So this is sort of the essence of the neo-reactionary understanding of where we find ourselves politically in the United States and the West generally.
How do you view Donald Trump through that filter of like a press-controlled state? Because he was certainly an anomaly in some ways, but at the same time, at the end of the day, here we are. We didn't really see massive change due to his animosity towards the press. I'm just kind of curious how you see him playing into this sort of dichotomy.
Yeah, so Donald Trump was an anomaly that wasn't supposed to happen, but these things do happen occasionally, and the regime is very skilled at integrating these anomalies into itself. So I view Trump a lot like Senator McCarthy, basically as someone who sees this problem and he sort of rolls up thinking that he's just going to, come in and clean house. But the problem is actually 100 times at least more larger than he actually understood it was. And, so you're coming in with like a tank, and you really need to be coming in with an army, basically, because, McCarthy only scratched the surface, and Donald Trump only really scratched the surface. And really the fundamental problem with President Trump is that, he did not represent a true break from the regime, and he was not really willing to rule. That's really the problem. Trump could
Which is funny, because the biggest criticism from the left is that, he's a tyrant, he's this and that. And you might say that's his biggest flaw, is that he wasn't, maybe in some ways.
Right. The actual successful tyrants in American history are people like Franklin Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. These are the types of presidents that Donald Trump should have modeled his presidency after if he actually understood how things work and wanted to, drain the swamp, as he said, is basically you just come in and you act like you're in charge instead of just being in charge on paper. This is why actually the left overreacted to him to such a great extent, because they, of course, had no idea what type of president he was going to be. If Donald Trump did actually come in and simply fire the entire State Department, this could have been a big problem. Even if the Supreme Court says no, you can't do that, or the legislature tries to tell him no, in reality, the way the branches of government work is they're sort of these co-equal sovereigns. We sort of have like 3 unlimited branches of government as opposed to 3 limited branches. And people like Franklin Roosevelt and Abe Lincoln are willing to just do whatever they feel like doing and simply defy the courts, defy the legislature. And if Trump had actually done that, it could have represented a legitimate threat to the system. Hopefully future Republican presidents, to the extent that, we can place any hope in that, which I don't really, but anyone who does come in and wants to achieve what Trump failed to do has to really be willing to rule from this perspective, essentially rule as a, ironically, in some sense, the way Dick Cheney defines the presidency, which is I think it's the unitary executive or something like that. Like basically anything the president says is legal. And this is kind of how you have to work things, because people don't really understand the way the executive branch works these days, is that it's almost entirely under the control of the legislature, because, they have laws in place, and the Constitution actually allows this to determine, who the president can appoint and how the appointments work. And, this is the exact problem Trump had, where he's trying to, work within the system, and the system is designed so that you actually cannot just come in and flip the whole thing over unless you're sort of willing to break the rules. So in some sense, this is the 3-party system working as intended. Of course, that doesn't really serve the system working as intended, isn't really serving American interests at this point.
And I'm just gonna chime in with what I know that there are certain people listening here are thinking right now, and especially because it is what you commonly hear as a criticism of neo-reactionaries in general, that neo-reactionaries are basically just fascists or monarchists or what have you. And how do you kind of filter that kind of that kind of discussion when you are on here basically saying we do need a strong man to come in. I mean, do you think that is the ideal form of government in a sense, or do you think it's more what we need now to combat what we have, as you described?
Yeah, I think I hesitate to call anything an ideal form because the appropriate form of government depends on the nation, the people, what sort of problem space you're dealing with. You know, for the Athenians, direct democracy worked fairly well for them. For the Spartans, their dual monarchy system worked very well. For the Romans, they had a different system. It was a very aristocratic republican system. They had monarchies. I think they had 6 kings originally in Rome before the Republic. So, you know, a monarchy isn't necessarily the ideal at all places at all times, but it is a much better system generally than democracy and even republicanism. And I would say that most neo-reactionaries are actually monarchists, not all. I would probably include myself as a monarchist. And the real reason for this is because if you look back at just the way power works in human history and how it is used effectively, when you end up with this massive bureaucratic oligarchical state that democracies often degrade into, the only real way to get rid of it is a sort of all-at-once transformation, and that really requires a unified plan and a unified center of power. So in some sense, monarchism is an answer to the permanent oligarchy that we have now, because the way the oligarchy keeps itself in place is it sort of has these democratic political institutions set out in front of it as sort of this virtualized combat space. So all of the political combat, which is a substitution for actual civil war, basically. That's what voting is, basically, is both sides show up to the polling booth instead of showing up on the battlefield, and this is preferable, right? But this whole political arena we find ourselves in is really just a virtualized arena that doesn't actually affect anything. And this is exactly what you saw, President Trump run into. This is what we see when we try to elect congressmen that would serve our interests, even libertarian congressmen, is they sort of just get controlled by this oligarchical system. So the only real way to overturn it is to simply have one power center that simply replaces it all at once. An all-at-once transformation is preferable too, because whenever you have sort of a drawn-out political struggles, then you actually have the potential for actual conflict to break out. We would like peaceful transformation of government in the United States, as we've more or less, with some notable exceptions, always had. And monarchy can actually achieve this weirdly through this one weird democratic trick, right? Which is you could call a referendum. And you've actually seen this happen in countries before, like in Egypt after the Arab Spring, where basically the people sort of hold their own election in order to say, we would like to replace this government with a new government. And we would like the new government to be transferred to these people. So this is actually a really cool system, because the people who are enabling the transfer of power aren't the ones receiving the power, and this actually this can prevent conflict breaking out. So if the public democratically transfers sovereignty to a single individual, as opposed to that individual sort of trying to seize power for themselves, this gives that individual clean hands and the popular mandate to act, basically, and simply remove the oligarchy as the new sovereign. And of course, listeners, of course, will be skeptical of the idea of monarchy, because, the 20th century, people have this idea of dictators, and a monarch is not a dictator. And the monarchs of the Ancien Regime, basically before the French Revolution, were not like the totalitarian dictators we see now. Of course, Hans Hermann Hoppe basically writes about this. The key difference between the monarchs from before the French Revolution and all the forms of the government that came after is sort of this integral connection between the monarch and the church, and not the right to rule, but the duty to rule in the interests of your nation, and to do so in a moral way aligned with the teachings of the church. Obviously, this is not perfect. There is no perfect system of government that's going to be resilient to all negative aspects of that particular government. But I believe that this is a superior system to the democratic one we have at the moment. And I kind of find it difficult to really see how monarchy could not be preferable to the entrenched oligarchy we see now, because I don't see any other solution to the oligarchy than going through this route. And like I said, it is a route taken many times in history. Again, Roman Empire is a really great example, but there are plenty of other examples of this as well. Even the great tyrannical regime of the French Revolution was resolved into a monarchy, into Napoleon Bonaparte, who is a problem in of himself. But this is the pattern you see when these extremely these corrupted democracies enter into this entrenched state where they're simply no longer governing responsibly. That there's no element of responsibility in the system we have now. This is one of the differences between oligarchy and monarchy, where a monarch is actually responsible and accountable, because, as you say, the buck stops with him. So I'll leave it at that, because you probably want to ask another question at this point.
No, this is all great. The more my guests talk, the better.
All right, guys. Well, you have seen it. You have felt it. It is clear that inflation is running rampant. And this, of course, has a lot of people more than ever looking to invest in cryptocurrencies. But one issue that can come with that is, of course, you got to pay taxes on those gains. Well, guess what? That is where our friends at iTrust Capital come in. With iTrust Capital, you can actually trade and earn on cryptocurrencies completely tax-free. That's right. By doing so within an IRA. IRAs, Roth IRAs are one of the best tax structures out there, one of the best deals. I've had an IRA for years, and now I know I can go to my friends at iTrust Capital to start a cryptocurrency IRA. And it's not just cryptocurrency. You can also self-trade physical gold and silver in an IRA with iTrust Capital. It is really just the best deal going. You can invest in cryptocurrencies and precious metals for completely tax-free gain. Whether you hold these assets for the long term or you buy and sell with the market, iTrust Capital's IRA account provides the absolute lowest transaction costs and transparent pricing in the industry by far. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to pause this podcast, or maybe you can multitask. I don't know. I can multitask. I want you to visit itrustcapital.com to get your completely free insider's report on Bitcoin and crypto IRAs. This costs you absolutely nothing, and this report will have absolutely everything you need to know about the fees, security, 24/7 access, and so much more. And I want you to use promo code LIONS to get your first month for free. That's promo code LIONS. Again, head over to itrustcapital.com, use promo code LIONS, or head over to lionsofliberty.com. Find the show notes for today's episode. Click on that link, get that free report, and start investing for your future today.
Could you foresee any realistic way that this sort of like all or nothing change could occur in the United States as constituted today, or is this just too fractured of a system? Because I mean, for the past, and this kind of ties into the article that we'll get into in a bit, but the 20th century has basically been one steady march of progressivism. No matter who has been in power, no matter what happens with elections, it has been just in absolutely one direction this whole time. But it has been over the course of a century or so, while we just kind of have this system as the sort of the facade of that change, that very I guess gradual, might be gradual or drastic depending on your kind of big picture outlook of it. But could you see? I mean, I'm just trying to envision how this could happen in our current society. Is that possible, or is the press too powerful to allow that something like that? I mean, just what are your general thoughts on the realistic aspects of what you're sort of describing in our modern society here?
Well, is it possible? Yes. Is it realistic? I don't think any particular path out of our current problem is realistic at this point. I think the most likely thing that's going to happen in this century really is the United States is going to become more like Brazil, and then more like Venezuela. And then if we're lucky, perhaps finally someone will come along and say, enough of this, we're going to have order again. So I certainly
think that's a troubling prospect.
Yeah. It certainly is. I think it is more likely that we would resolve this problem through a monarchical solution. I think the least likely thing that would happen is that we sort of reset the government purely through the democratic institutions that it has set up for us in order to self-govern, so to speak. I don't think we're ever going to get out of this through the actual normal system of voting as we envision it. Like I said, there is this other trick of democracy where you can just hold your own election, right? I think that's really the path forward if we want to find a democratic means out of this problem. So I don't think it's likely that we're going to escape the decline of empires that every single empire has gone through. But maybe we can certainly land on our feet in ways that other empires fail to do so. Because decline and collapse of empire doesn't mean the nation or the people
doesn't mean everybody dies.
Right, exactly. But it's going to be better or it's going to be worse. We would like it to be better, and we would like whatever is next after the American Empire, maybe the country is even still called the United States of America, whatever that is, we would like to get there in the cleanest and quickest way possible. And we would like to not become Brazil. We would certainly like to not become Venezuela, but those are the paths that we are on and are sort of like the default most likely outcome at this point. And really it's likely because people aren't really willing to put a lot of energy into big change that they're not used to until things start to get bad, like not having food, which is something we could actually see inflicted on us in the near future.
Yeah, it seems like we're at least going in that direction where there's supply chain issues, and well, I'm not in the U.S., so I don't know what's going on at grocery stores there, but I hear things are getting kind of nasty. But this is a pretty good segue into the article that you posted a week or two ago, called, in case we haven't ruffled enough feathers so far. This one is called Libertarian Diagnostic Failure. And I'll just kind of lay the background of it. It kind of stemmed from a poll that Dave Smith posted about whether the 20th century was a liberal triumph or an illiberal disaster. That stemmed from a tweet from Jeff Deist, who I'm actually speaking with on my next interview, where he described two broad types of libertarians: those who think the 20th century was a liberal triumph, eye roll, and those who think it was an illiberal disaster. But you actually kind of inserted your own third option, and you actually described the 20th century as a liberal disaster, not an illiberal disaster. So why don't we just kind of start there? Why do you describe it? Why do you describe the I guess the march of democracy and everything that we have seen in terms of the expansion of government and such? Why do you see that as liberal as opposed to illiberal? And a lot of this is just kind of how we define terms, but maybe you can kind of start by making that distinction for us.
Yeah, so the way I define terms, political terms, is based on what actually happens when people put them into practice, or at least think they are putting them into practice, and not really so much as they're defined purely in the ideal or intellectual sense. So you see socialists do this with socialism, where socialism is defined as like the equitable distribution of the means of production in society, or something like that. But what socialism actually is the very unequal and very totalitarian form of oligarchy that sort of levels out most of society and reserves the benefits of it for one particular set of elite. And it's very inefficient. And it turns out that socialism is not this. Socialism is just tyranny and decay. And there is actually no way to create this sort of equity that socialism describes itself as being capable of on paper, and actually maintain a civilization, right? So conservatism, similar, right? So conservatism is defined as basically maintaining the longstanding traditions of your society, because these traditions are good. Like Chesterton's fence is good. You might not know why the fence is there, but this thing is there to protect you from something that you might not fully understand, but someone put it there for a good reason, right? But of course, in practice, conservatism is progressivism driving the speed limit. Conservatism is just liberalism, but slower. So it doesn't really matter if you call yourself a conservative in the political sense and you claim it's this. In practice, we see what it actually is. And I take the same view of liberalism. We can define liberalism as the libertarians do, where liberalism is this system of human society in which there's no coercion used against people to force them into any particular behaviors. People are free to act in any way so long as it doesn't basically inflict coercion, the use of force on anyone else, unless in response to the use of force. And this is especially applicable to the idea of the free market. So people can trade completely, unregulated and freely with each other, so long as no force is used on anyone, and force should not be used. And liberalism is very much about the individual having the free choice to act, basically. And every type of association should be voluntary, and this will produce like the most well-ordered society, because force is inefficient, cooperation is more efficient, and this will allow people to build a better system. So that's what liberalism is essentially defined as. But what liberalism has actually been over the last several centuries is this individuating force that has basically disintegrated all of the long-standing bonds between the peoples of their respective nations and their religions, and collapsed the ancient integrated structures that govern the societies, and replaced those structures with purely self-interested oligarchs. And these new rulers, they don't rule with this sense of greater duty and responsibility for their civilization. They rule in their self-interest. They rule for the self, just like in a liberal society, everyone is really looking after the self more than anything. And of course, people choose to look after their own families and things like this. But what's lacking is this larger national structure holding things together. So I see liberalism as sort of being the source of tearing down all of these ancient structures that paved the way for socialism and other totalitarian systems. If it wasn't for the liberalism that especially instantiated itself in the French Revolution, but in subsequent revolutions in the 19th century, like in 1848, we couldn't have gotten to the type of states we have today, the total states that libertarians so despise. These type of states really started more than 200 years ago at this point. And even people you might consider reactionary, like Bismarck, the great German Prussian statesman, were actually largely responsible for this to some extent. So this is what I see liberalism fundamentally doing. It's one thing to have this idea of human liberty and freedom, which are actually different concepts, I think. But it's another thing to see what it does in practice. And in practice, it has simply upended our civilization by the roots and turned everything on its head. And I see a direct line between liberalism and exactly where we are now in the total state.
Do you think that the way you described, I guess, the libertarian view of liberalism as, free markets, being more ideal? I mean, I know I've heard you talk about, you seem very well versed in like Austrian economics and that sort of thing. Do you think that it's true? Like, forget the term for a minute, but for whether the term liberalism should apply to or not, do you think that ideal is true in the general sense, but there's just a but there? Is there just like, yeah, but then when we get to politics, it's kind of a whole new ballgame?
Yeah, well, there's really two types of libertarianism. There's Austrian economics, and then there's political libertarianism. And these things are really entirely separate. Especially Austrian economics really has nothing to do with political libertarianism, in the sense that it's purely a logical field of study on its own. And whether or not this political movement called libertarianism exists is kind of irrelevant. Austrian economics is really I would consider it basically the most advanced understanding humans have yet to reach about how human action, as we call it, economics, actually works. So I would say Austrian economics is true, or it's correct if you prefer. It's absolutely correct in terms of how the markets work, in terms of the idea of people freely cooperating. I basically agree with. I don't disagree with Austrian economics at all. I think it is correct. I'm no expert on economics, but I have been. I've followed a lot of Austrian economics people over the last several years, and they've basically convinced me that the Austrian economics Austrian analysis is simply correct. So if you want to have the most efficient economy that best serves people's interest in anything ranging from healthcare to agriculture, you should really organize it with no state intervention whatsoever, because this is only going to introduce corruption and inefficiencies in the market. And if you're interested in things like, the just price, say from the Catholic perspective, the way you're going to get the best prices for anything is just in a free market. Is the free market going to be perfect? No, it's when humans actually act in the real world, they never act perfectly. They don't always act, as you would call good. But if you want the best economy, it really should be an Austrian economy. So that's Austrian economics. But then libertarianism is this entirely different ball game, where you have things like the non-aggression principle and these sort of moral injunctions on what you should and shouldn't do to people. And I think Austrian economics is very much free of this. Austrian economics is
descriptive more than prescriptive.
Exactly. It's descriptive and not prescriptive. Libertarianism is proscriptive, and it sort of proscribes itself's limitations that prevent it from actually acting in the field of power. And this is really sort of the fundamental problem with libertarianism as opposed to Austrian economics. And I'm not saying that libertarians should abandon the concept of liberty. I think the entire reason I'm interested in libertarianism is because libertarians seem to be the only people actually interested in liberty anymore, which I am also interested in as well. I just think
even if you think they're going about it all wrong, at least we have the same sort of idea behind it. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, the main reason they've gone about it wrong is because the Libertarian Party has been subverted by leftists, where the Austrian the Mises Institute is not, really, because the Mises Institute is sort of based on this very logically rigorous type of study that everyone in the field of Austrian economics really holds each other to. But politics is sort of a different thing, where you can't really base human action in the real world, or human political action, I should say, on these like strict, rigorous ideological principles, because people are hypocrites. And when you're trying to act politically, it's not this entirely logical field of study. It's not, you can't reduce politics down to a formula like you can Austrian economics, where you're just sort of mathematically describing, what will happen if you do a certain thing. You can't describe exactly what will happen in the real world. Like if you institute a certain policy, or if you run a candidate with a certain platform, you can use statistics to sort of guess at what will happen, but politics is sort of not this entirely rigorous arena like economics is. So you have to act in a more fluid manner, and to some sense, you sort of have to, I guess you could say, break your own principles in some way. Like this is the problem with libertarianism, right? Is you don't want to tell anyone what to do, but at the end of the day, if you want to have a libertarian society, you're going to have to tell people what to do, because you're going to have to take political power, which involves ruling, which is telling people what to do. So you sort of run into this weird conundrum in libertarianism in the democracy we have now, where it's sort of at odds with itself.
And so a lot of people might hear that and say, well, you don't need to tell other people what to do to be free yourself. You don't need, you can have your own, covenant communities or enclaves or what have you, and kind of form your own communities, and you can do that without aggressing on other people. What's the problem with that? Why does that not work in reality?
The problem is other people are not happy with that. Not only does it seem like most other people aren't actually interested in liberty at all, but they're not even interested in you having it. It's very clear that the modern left simply will not tolerate this type of free covenant society existing anywhere, especially within the continental United States. They say this openly. This is part of the whole system of Californians emigrating to other states. They don't want you to ever have freedom anywhere in the world. The left is an entirely totalitarian universalist ideology. So the thing is, if you want to actually have your covenant community or your libertarian community, it's going to have to be of a certain size to actually defend itself. Even if that means, just making people be free, being free by force, basically. Because, a tiny county size like microstate, maybe it could exist for a little while, but that sort of thing is simply not going to be tolerated by the totalitarian left. So, ultimately you're going to need a power like the United States to actually be a libertarian or free country in order to actually maintain that freedom. And that is going to involve telling a number of people, this is simply a free country, and you're not allowed to be California is not allowed to be communist, right? Sorry, you're free to choose most things, but communism is just not something you're going to be free to choose. Simply because the effects of that is that we know how communists and the left works. They work through subversion, and when you allow them to sort of to freely organize and build power within your midst, ultimately that is going to subvert and undermine the order you've put in place. And for that reason, it's just one of those things that can't be allowed. Basically, if you want to have a libertarian country, you actually do need a powerful state behind it. It can be a small state, but it has to be one that's willing to use force when necessary to prevent itself from being undermined by these type of interests, particularly from democracy, right? Like a libertarian state should be a monarchy, because there's really no need for democracy in a libertarian state at the federal level, because the rule would be there's nothing to change. It's a free country. You're not allowed to vote yourself into communism, basically, right? This is kind of the problem we've had now, and
Just to want that one guy there to say, yeah, be free. Those are our laws for the most part,
Yeah, exactly. And if freedom is so good, I don't really think it's that bad to tell people you're going to be free by force and you're going to like it, basically. I mean, it's just like, this is what you're going to have to be willing to stomach if you actually are interested in your own liberty. Because if you don't sort of take politics to that level, other people who actually do really want to hurt you are going to take power, as we see now, and then they're just going to act out their policies instead. You can't organize societies at a large scale on this purely voluntarist basis, because it's simply not a powerful enough myth to appeal to people. Nations are really built on myths. Myths are extremely powerful. Right now we're ruled by this sort of evil, perverted American myth of equality and equity, where the true American myth really is about liberty, and not this concept of equality. So, I think on that basis alone, any libertarian leader, even president, has all of the mandate and right that he needs to say that, look, we're just not going to tolerate, California being communists. You can have a high tax rate, higher than other states, maybe to some limited degree. It's not like you have to, restrict every single policy. You don't even have to have 50 states. You can have counties or whatever, self-ruling. It's just that you have to prevent certain types of things from occurring at a certain level. If there's one guy, if there's like three guys who want to form a hippie commune or whatever, it's not like the state has to be totalitarian in this sense and sort of intervening in people's lives on like it does right now. But there are certain things you're going to have to prevent people from doing. You're going to have to aggress on them, before they actually aggress on you, because the construction of any amount of communist subversion, socialist subversion, leftist subversion is itself a threat to the very existence of liberty. But again, this is at odds with how libertarians think, right? They can't think of ever using force against someone except in response to force. But sort of the problem is that hasn't happened in the United States, right? It's not like socialists have. Well, in some cases they have, but for the most part, socialism has just sort of democratically instantiated itself in the United States. And there was no no one's coming to your house at gunpoint in order to tell you, okay, well, you're going to have you're going to pay for healthcare, and you're going to be taxed this much. I mean, there ultimately is a gun behind it, right? But people don't view it this way because the gun is so abstracted from you just paying your taxes every year. So
it's like 8 degrees of separation from the actual gun, and most people never get to that 8th degree or whatever it may be.
Right. And because of that, you can't sort of like wait for the gun to actually come to 0 degrees of separation. You have to just say, we're not going to allow ourselves to get in this circumstance in the first place. So that's kind of my main criticism in the article.
All right, guys, before we wrap up here, I got to let you know about one of our great sponsors, our longtime sponsors at Lorenzotti, Italy. If you are a fan of coffee, if you like a nice fresh cup of joe to wake up in the morning, as I do, you're going to want to check out our friends at Lorenzotti, Italy. They deliver fine, premium Italian coffees right to your door in these nice little tins that look so wonderful sitting on your counter there. And if that weren't all enough, these guys are great libertarians. They are Patreon supporters of this show. They are absolutely worthy of your support. If that all wasn't enough, these guys do more than just sell coffee. They also help other entrepreneurs set up their own coffee businesses, help them acquire equipment, acquire financing, everything they need to start their own coffee business, start their own coffee shops. So you definitely want to check them out for that reason if that's something that's been on your mind. Either way, just fantastic people at Lorenzotti, Italy. Amazing people, fantastic people. You'll want to support them if you're fans of the show. Heck, even if you're not, if you're listening to this by accident, check them out anyway. They have great coffee. Lorenzotti, Italy. You can find them at lorenzotti.coffee. That's LORENZOTTI.coffee. And you do not want to forget your Lions of Liberty listener discount. Just use discount code ROAR for 10% off your order.
I want to try to look at what maybe an example you can think of, like where, because I mean, when we break it through the non-aggression principle, a lot of libertarians might say, well, it's just about defining what aggression is. So, if people are conspiring to, push you into a communist system or what have you, then perhaps they would call that aggression. And then that doesn't require or, justify force in response. But, if you just look at it at the micro level, like say like the 3 guys forming a commune down the street, well, okay, we can leave them alone pretty much as long as that's all they're really doing. But what's a situation where you might say, okay, we can't just leave these people alone because the sort of the extent to which they're organizing, perhaps, we can actually see, okay, if we let this go on, that them organizing over there will quickly, before we have a chance to do anything about it, become them ruling over us over here. Is there kind of a way you can break that down in sort of our modern context?
Well, definitely a salient example would be something on the scale of Chaz, as we saw last year, where, Seattle basically just becomes a sort of communist microstate for a few weeks. And obviously that was all just kind of astroturfed and allowed by the regime anyway. But it's that sort of thing that you would have to prevent. But even more so, you have to be willing to censure the sort of more insidious things that sort of lead to the decay of order in your society. Hollywood is a big problem. Basically you can't allow basically your film industry to do nothing but basically distribute leftist propaganda, right? And that's like basically all Netflix is now at this point.
Yeah, pretty much what we have now.
So even stuff like that, it's not only about preventing sort of ideological communism from taking root, but it's also about preventing this sort of indirect type of subversion you see. Again, Hans Hermann Hoppe talks about this. You can't allow like these pride parades happening as we see now, because this undermines the moral foundation of the society. It undermines the traditional order of things, that actually the myth that keeps everything in place, right? So that's actually another thing that a libertarian state would have to prevent is these pride parades, because they're this element of subversion, subverting like the traditional way of human beings socializing and human and sexual norms. And we always see a very direct connection between leftism and what we would call sexual degeneracy. There's a reason for this. And that's the kind of thing.
I've been to a number of Libertarian Party events and gatherings, and yeah, it's there. Yeah, once the after hours parties start, even before then. So
yeah, this is kind of the problem with like the left libertarians that have taken over the party. You don't see this with the hardcore Austrian economics guys. They're all well, not all, but they tend to be very serious Christians often, or at least very I would say just traditional in their family life, and they have a respect for the civilization really that they're a part of, and they're interested in maintaining it. And the these sort of leftist subversions like we see in Hollywood, where well, I guess I shouldn't. This would be a spoiler for the James Bond movie, but they're doing things. They're sort of Hollywood is sort of doing this like cultural terrorism, basically, to all of the movies, and you see this happening with the Lord of the Rings now, where they're going to make the Lord of the Rings show coming out on Amazon like progressive and very you're probably going to see. We'll
The
be
ring is now a cock ring or something like that.
Yeah, stuff at that level, right? And this is actually an intentionally subversive element, right? And so this is the kind of thing that at scale can't be allowed to propagate itself in a society. It's one thing if you have like one edgy independent filmmaker, but when the entire film industry, when the entire technological industry is 100% on the side of leftism, that's simply a thing that just cannot be allowed. It has to be said, like, look, you're not allowed to do this. You're not allowed to basically censor anyone who's going to contradict the regime's opinion on how the biomedical security state should be set up. That simply cannot be allowed. But because leftism has basically subverted every single part of our society, and most people are just sort of fully on board with it. Obviously, no one has the power to do that. But if libertarians found themselves in a position of power one day, this is the kind of thing you would have to do to prevent the decay from happening again. Because if you go to this purely anarchic state, well, basically the same process that happened already is just going to repeat itself again. And you'll see these sort of socialist states emerge, and they're just going to take over everything. And libertarians will end up in this tiny microstate that eventually gets taken over again anyway. So if you're really interested in preserving liberty in the long term, you need power behind it, right? That's how nations maintain themselves. You have to have power. The whole problem with liberalism and the way the U.S. is formulated in some senses, it's always trying to hide power, to sort of pocket it away, to sort of disintegrate it and distribute it such that there's like less power, but that's not actually possible to do. There's always power and the expression of it in any human society. And you're either going to be under the rule of that power or you're going to be the power. There's really only two choices. You can't ever get rid of this idea of human beings coming to rule over each other. It's simply against human nature. This is sort of a fundamental that's almost on the level of the fundamental observations Mises makes about human action. It's really that integral to human nature.
What would you say to I guess modern day libertarians, or maybe just other people like you who want their own personal liberty in a sense, but have just have been wrapped up in this concept of libertarianism or the non-aggression principle, and they want to see the change in their own lives, so maybe they take some kind of step, like say moving from California to Texas or something, like and maybe that does help them in the short term, like maybe things are a little better in Texas or a little better in Florida, but would you say that even making those steps, maybe you're just kicking the can a little bit, but you're not actually going to see those changes because maybe in your view California is still coming for you?
Yeah, so the idea that most people, including myself, sort of promote as a sort of interim step is this idea of parallelism, building a parallel free market economy, basically. I'm planning on doing this with a few of my friends, basically, sort of building a sort of micro covenant where, we just purchase property together and we sort of go off the grid and this sort of thing. And I think that this is something that, most people really ought to be doing at this point. It kind of should be obvious at this point that you should be doing this and really starting small businesses and building your own parallel economy along the side of what's happening now. This is important because this will be what allows us to build the sort of power base, the economic base, to actually organize and oppose the regime in any serious sense. I would say, it would be better to do it in Texas than California. So moving to Texas is a good example. Florida might be even better. Perhaps some Pacific Northwest states might be even better. There are not many places in America at this point that really are friendly to the idea of liberty, but there are a few. So I think, and this is very much in line with kind of what libertarians want anyway, is to sort of build their own, their own communities that they run. And that's really what we're going to have to do over the next several decades in order to actually build up the demonstrative example of like how this can actually work, right? Because you sort of have to put your money where your mouth is. And if people are able to build small communities or even neighborhoods that are sort of self-sustaining and functioning and have their own sort of microeconomy between them, apart from this tyrannical regime we find ourselves in, that will show other people that there's sort of an alternative and a better way of living. And this is sort of how you build the kind of political base that you then organize into these sort of organized minorities that can funnel power through leaders and then enact political change that way. And you basically trying to start your own nation from the ground up, basically. So that's sort of a practical thing to do in the individual interest that also serves the sort of greater political ends, is to just sort of go off the grid, basically, and try to separate yourself from all dependencies on the tyrannical state we have now, and try to integrate yourself into economic activity with other people of the same mindset, so that the money flows between us and not back into the tyrannical regime. And if we can build all the necessary institutions to support ourselves, even if we're distributed over vast geographic areas through things like cryptocurrency, we can still do commerce with each other. So this is a sort of practical aim. Now, if you want to aim big, and I think we do ultimately have to aim big, and this sort of plays into that, is we really need to figure out how to convince basically conservatives or Republicans to stop participating in this sort of deeply fake system of government we have. Stop voting for this fake right-wing party that we have, and recognize that to the degree they're interested in liberty, this whole corrupt system needs to be replaced. And if we can keep spreading these ideas of neo-reaction and this idea of just sort of replacing the U.S. government and detaching people from the Constitution, conservatives are obsessed with the Constitution in a way that libertarians are not, and this is a very useful thing libertarians bring to the table. Libertarians can point out very well the problems in the Constitution, like the Commerce Clause that sort of enables most of this nonsense. So we need to sort of get over this attachment to the entire American government, and reattach ourselves to the idea of the American myth of liberty. And if you can make that step as a conservative, then you can be willing to do something crazy like hold a referendum to elect a monarch, basically. Which people have this weird idea that this is like un-American, but electing a monarch or desiring a monarch is actually a pretty normal thing historically, even for democracies. I mean, people know that to some extent people wanted George Washington to be the king, but even at other times, the Germans in the 19th century asked Friedrich Wilhelm to be their king, basically, because they wanted one, right? They had a parliamentary democracy, and they were like, hey, we really need a king to run this show because this democratic system is insufficient. And he actually declined it on the grounds of not wanting a crown from the gutter, basically. So it's not at all
where did
weird.
German democracy eventually lead?
And yeah, of course, this is sort of the bastardized idea of monarchical power that people have. The dictator is totally different from the monarch. The dictator really is this sort of ultimate actualization of the totalitarianism of democracy, and that's it. The dictator
is like democracy with just one face on it, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And the dictator is just sort of acting out the will of the people in this very mundane sense. But that's not what a monarch does. That's not what a monarch is for. A monarch is there to be to bring order and to be responsible for that order, and not necessarily to be at the service of the popular will, as we call it. The popular will is actually this very deleterious concept that, of course, plays directly into the idea of socialism, as you see with basically every dictator that came about in the 20th century. So anyway, kind of went on a tangent there, but that's kind of my recommendations.
I'm a fan of tangents. It's all good. Speaking of tangents, actually, I got to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I do actually want to take somewhat of a tangent because I was browsing your Substack, and one article that I just want to touch on real quick because it really struck with me. First of all, it's just entertaining and made me chuckle. It's the article called "Booty Envy" about Nicki Minaj. So obviously, I mean, a title like that, how could I not click and just see what it was about? But when you really dug into it, and talking about how conservatives might jump on the bandwagon of certain celebrities that, for some brief moment or on some one issue, might sort of be on their side, and then they kind of all jump on the bandwagon. But I see libertarians do this all the time, and it kind of drives me nuts. Whether it's Elon Musk saying something good about cryptocurrency, or like Jack Dorsey posting an Enemy of the State, you'll see all these libertarians just jumping at him, and it's kind of pathetic, really. They'll say, "Oh, welcome aboard! Oh, look, we've got one!" And it's like, just because they said this one thing, or just because they did this one thing, it doesn't mean that they support the things you think they support, or that they're really on your side. But you do kind of get into that in that article, so I'll let you kind of do your own breakdown of it.
Yeah, so this is really common. I mean, basically, Nicki Minaj came out kind of against the needlecraft a few weeks ago, and people got really excited, like she's a new ally or something. But I mean, this person is a leftist through and through. This person is deeply embedded into the subversive elements of Hollywood and the entertainment industry. This person is not on your side in any sense. This person is not a conservative. She is a leftist, and there's no reason to really sort of be promoting this person as this sort of ally. If Nicki Minaj is going to cause problems for the regime, that's great, that's fine. But the enemy of your enemy is not your friend. Don't ever interrupt the enemy when they're making a mistake. But there's no reason to get involved in this process or act like it's a win for us, because people on the right, we didn't do anything to cause this, right? This is just a leftist attacking other leftists, and we can laugh at that, but
it's not a conservative victory of any kind.
No, and you see the same thing. What I get into in that article is I talk about AOC and her tax the rich dress. Basically every time AOC does anything, you just see right-wing media just bringing a ton of attention to it. Like, we just feed into this cycle when you should just be absolutely ignoring these people. Like, the fact that all of these crazy lefties get so much attention from the right, to the point where the Daily Wire even made some really nice communist propaganda for her, it's just a ridiculous relationship. There's no reason for us to have any relationship whatsoever with leftists. Like, I basically have a policy where I won't even talk to leftists. Like, I won't go on a leftist podcast. I have no interest in communicating with them. This is the basic Schmittian friend-enemy distinction. I mean,
well, if that's the case, I'll tell you which libertarian podcast to avoid. Leftists. We can talk about that off air.
So it's like, conservatives and people on the right generally, they really need to embrace the Schmittian friend-enemy distinction and understand that when you sort of see this thrashing happen sometimes from other leftists, that this isn't something to lean into. We really want to lean into our own stuff, our own accomplishments, as I was describing, like we could do earlier. We want to work entirely within our own parallel circle and just sort of be agnostic to these events that happen. And if events happen that, serve our interests, great. But, if it's being led by a leftist, basically, we shouldn't really get involved, because we have to disconnect from this system at a very fundamental level to actually have any chance of really overturning it.
Yeah, it might be fun to watch the left eat each other alive, and we can smile slyly to ourselves when we see it happen and enjoy the show. But we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking it's some kind of victory for liberty.
No, and of course, what happens after they eat each other alive? Even worse, leftists come out of it, right? That's what happens.
Yeah. All right, well, Charlemagne, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts with us. It's been fun. So I'll give you the chance to plug away on everything you got going on.
Cool. Yeah. So the Substack, if you want to read it, charlemagne.substack.com. I also have a YouTube channel. If you search about the cathedral and Moldbug, you'll definitely find my channel if it doesn't show up under Charlemagne directly. I also fairly regularly appear on another YouTube channel called The Academic Agent, who hosts the cigar streams, which I co-host occasionally. And on those we study particular texts to some significant depth with other guests. So that's a very good place to go if you want to sort of check out my general circle. And if you want to see sort of the source of the Neoreactionary ideology, look up the Unqualified Reservations blog by Mencius Moldbug. Curtis Yarvin. And yeah, I think that's it.
All right, Charlemagne, thanks a lot, man. I really appreciate it. Keep up the great work, man. Keep on roaring.
Thank you.
Live long and live free.